Many of you might be familiar with Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And this is his second habit, to start with the end in mind. So in planning, that's always an important principle, isn't it? He says, if your ladder is not leaning against the right wall, every step you take will bring you to the wrong place faster. So thinking about the development education work that you're doing in your schools and acknowledging you're all in different places, what is the purpose or the end in mind when you're doing this work? Because clearly you represent people who are committed and interested and already involved. And just wanted to start by asking you to think about that question, and even for yourself saying, for me, the wall that I've got my ladder against and where I want to get to with my students is this. This is what I'm hoping to achieve in relation to the impact of this with our students. This is at the end of the day what for me it's all about. Okay? Would you mind just jotting down a sentence or thinking in your own head? If you're not into writing, that's fine. Your thoughts on that. What for you is the end that you have in mind? At the heart of it all, what is it you're trying to achieve? And I suspect that when you go back to your schools, there might be a divergence of viewpoints in relation to what you might be hoping for. And I've just some of them up here on this slide. Because sometimes in talking with principals in particular, you'd often hear principals saying, oh, we've lots of dev ed projects and it's great, creates a great buzz, and the word enjoyment, which is fine, and all learning should be enjoyable and should be engaging. However, if that's all it's about, and it's creating a good photo opportunity for the school magazine, then it's questionable really, isn't it? If that is kind of, I suppose, the primary motivation. Another one I often come across is, and nobody said it here, but it's frequently said, it helps students to appreciate how lucky they are. And again, that's a worrisome one, isn't it? You're nodding, so I don't need to go any further than that. The personal skills is another one that's frequently mentioned. Students develop a lot of interpersonal skills. They have to go out organising things, frequently events, which is very good for them. Frequently, there's reference to their critical thinking skills, again, very important, and so on. But if it's all about what they're going to get in terms of their personal skills, then dev ed can be very self-serving and self-seeking in a sense. So that can be one to be a bit cautious around if it's up there in terms of the reasons that you're promoting development education. And even to the extreme case where you'd often hear students now wanting to go on the linking project overseas because it's good for their CV. And sometimes even promoted as such. Again, why? What's the message that's going out to students there if that's the motivation and that's why they're doing it? These are the kinds of things you've mentioned here already this morning from those that shared from the floor. It's about understanding the world we live in, and particularly the root causes of poverty and inequality, and empowering students to be agents for change. So these also feature. But I'd suggest that within a staff, there's probably a myriad of opinions and motivations, and sometimes even within ourselves and within our students. And it's really important to focus down and say, as to paraphrase Covey, to say, well, which wall are we putting our ladder against, and where do we want to go with this, and what are the messages that we're communicating, and to plan for that. So it is, as Lizzie earlier on had a definition of development education, and here's a shorter version. It's about helping students to understand the root causes, getting to the structures, not just the superficial understanding of the world we live in, and understanding that leading to meaningful action. And meaningful is the key word there. Thoughtful, critical, you could add as well. So in a lot of the research, and you're saying, God, she's supposed to be talking about planning. I'm going to just give a little bit of the background first and then move into some practical ideas around planning, don't worry. But I do think it's important that even though you're in schools that are committed to development education and probably doing an awful lot of work in it, the evidence of the impact and what's happening for all of our interventions isn't really very reassuring. If you're interested in this area, there's Audrey Byron's work on learning to read the world, where she has done extensive research in schools and interviewing students and teachers about what they're doing and their thoughts and attitudes and motivations and so on. This one from 2007 was a very extensive piece of research as well on development education in Irish post-primary schools. And the SUAS survey of 2013 was interesting because it talked to third level students who have come through our system about their understanding and levels of analysis, we'll say, of the world in which we live in. So those ones are what I'm basing my slides on here for the next couple of minutes. The evidence is that students have a very high level of concern and interest. You don't need me to tell you that. You know from talking to your own students. They do care, they are interested. However, when you start probing, their level of understanding is very, very shallow and superficial. And that's despite, you know, all of these years, and you say, well, all of the areas of the curriculum where they can and should be encountering these issues, how come that they still have very shallow understanding? So we could stop and talk about that in detail. Similarly, when it comes to attitudes, the research isn't very reassuring to us, because again and again it still comes true that the dominant attitude that our students have is one of charity, and see themselves in the role of the powerful giver and the grateful receiver. Research tells us, the psychologists tell us, that when it comes to our attitudes, there's always an emotional component, a cognitive component, what we think, and also a behavioural component. And they all relate to each other. And in this regard, the key emotions that come through in all of the surveys, and even at the weekend I was reading another one from Australia and New Zealand where students have been surveyed about their attitudes, and these were the three words that came up again, very much resonating with the responses of Irish students: pity, sadness and guilt. Coupled with the belief in their helplessness. Therefore, we must help in order to make them like us, and clearly this paternalistic superiority kind of attitude then permeates all of this, and it all feeds into each other. So if that's where our students still are, despite all our best efforts, it does beg the question, when we're planning for development education, how can we plan for a more critical approach? And I think the starting point for a more critical approach needs to be beginning by questioning, well, why are we doing it anyway? And what are the attitudes, values, motivations, preconceptions, misconceptions that we're even bringing to it, and that our students are bringing to it? And this is very forcefully brought home to me. If I just share a little anecdote from my own child. In 4th class, coming home, Cara, she's now in 1st year in secondary school, but she had to do, as many children do in primary school, a project in Africa. And within that, they had to choose a country. So her little table at her group chose Kenya. And within that, then they broke it down, and one is doing food and the other is doing houses, and they all have to go off and research their topic and so on. So her topic was houses in Kenya, or in Africa, which was synonymous for her because, you know, as with most children, Africa is a country. So that was great. I thought that's fantastic when she came home, because at least I could help her with that. I'd been to Kenya. So I proceeded to talk to her. No, Mum, what would you know? So I said, well, okay, we look up the internet then, and we proceeded to look up sites, and I Googled real estate agents in Nairobi and started revealing houses, because she was doing a project in houses in Kenya, houses in Nairobi, and suddenly she saw brick houses, beautiful houses, some with swimming pools, some very much like her own house. No way, Mum, that could not be houses in Kenya. Well, what are you looking for, Cara? I'm looking for houses in Kenya. So this went on until we disclosed that her preconception was, as you can imagine, the Maasai warrior outside the hut, and nothing else could exist. So I use that just to challenge, I suppose, to not to tell you anything you don't already know, but it brought home powerfully for me the need to challenge the preconceptions that we bring to this, and indeed that her own teacher was bringing to this, because her teacher wasn't prepared to critique or challenge the images of the huts that she insisted on bringing in, despite my best efforts. So this is linked into the us and them. Our world is different, our world is better, and we have to make them more like us. And again, another anecdote that illustrates this very powerfully for me was when she had a speaker in more recently to the class to talk about Africa. In this case was children in South Africa. And I said, oh, that was very good, Cara. And what did she tell you, this lady? Well, Mum, it ain't pretty. That was the response. Our world is way better. You don't want to know, you don't want to go there. When it comes to the critical approach, at the heart of it all, I think, is the need to challenge the perception that somehow poverty is about bad luck. And we're lucky. Because it is a result of human choices and human structures. And to keep coming back to that again and again in all the work we do with our students is so important. And putting the human rights, human dignity and justice at the centre, which is a very different frame of reference than the charity model that is still unfortunately dominating a lot of the work. So to continue on in relation to the background to planning, I think if when you're sitting down to plan you're thinking how are we going to plan for more critical engagement in DevEd and more critical questioning, that's the key starting point. And at the heart of the critical questioning is a questioning of the causes of the problem. And frequently students confuse causes and consequences. This came through very much in this survey as well that SUAS did, where they asked, now these are college students, intelligent students, one would think, what are the causes of poverty in the world? And they gave them 20 possible answers. And most of the students ticked as their number ones, actually consequences. So they had things like disease, lack of education. Well, you could say that lack of education is both a cause and a consequence. Corruption, blaming the victim. Very few had the structures that trade, debt, and so on. And these were students that have come through our system. So again, in the classroom, you know, it might seem like, oh, well, you know, we're doing this all the time. I wonder, are we? Are we really looking at what's the root cause of the problem? What are the consequences? Are the consequences fair? Are there different perspectives? And the whole idea of bringing multiple perspectives to bear. Okay, so even in the case of Cara, yes, some Africans live in mud huts, but that's only one experience. There are other experiences as well. What are the different possible solutions and who has the power? There's Miriam Barby, I mentioned having done some work with her through the Loreto network recently, and she has this written up in her class. She's an English and history teacher, and every day that's there for the students to look at, whether they're investigating a novel, or characters in a novel, or aspects of history. Who has the power? Very powerful question. So, some pitfalls then to watch out for. Focusing on the causes or confusing causes and consequences. So for example, I went into a school on one occasion and the teacher came out and said, oh, the students have been doing loads of projects on the causes of poverty. And I looked along the walls and there was malaria and there was projects on dirty water and saying, these aren't the causes of poverty. They're interesting. They were all fairly negative images for the most part up on the walls, as would have to be said too. But the students were, by focusing on the diseases, were actually focusing on a consequence and not asking why and going any deeper. The tokenistic responses can manifest itself in a number of ways. It's whether it's some once-off events, and I'm not saying all once-off events are tokenistic, far from it, where there's good lead-in and planning and thoughtful preparation for a once-off event, and the students have a process of learning leading into it and reflection after it. Those kinds of events can be fantastic and can involve the whole school community. But sometimes that's not the way they're done, we have to be honest. And they can be a case of, oh yeah, that's that day done, tick that box, we've got the photos for the school magazine and move on. And sometimes they can lead to very personalised responses as well, where we've fundraised for the well or whatever it is, without looking at, well, why are people without water and what are the root causes. These two, learning without action and action without learning, are probably equally harmful in some ways, because if students learn about the issues and don't have opportunities to actually engage and take meaningful action, then it can become very disempowering and lead to cynicism. And in fact, the Australian research was quite surprising to me, because the level of cynicism that was coming through in the students that were interviewed in that research was very high, because they felt, oh, well, what's the point? We can't do anything anyway. And the other side of it is where students are doing a lot but not knowing what they're doing or why they're doing it. And I think we've a lot of that happening. You're nodding your head, which is also miseducational. So on to more positive things. So when planning for development education then, I think at the heart of it is this awareness of ourselves and where we're coming from, as I say, but also an awareness of the curriculum opportunities that are there. Now, if a teacher teaches out of the textbook, you can sometimes miss out on the opportunities. You need to teach from the syllabus. And I suppose after years of teaching, we tend not to look back at the syllabus documents. We tend to rely more on our own resources and textbooks and so on. And I think this was brought very powerfully home to me when I had to do this review for the NCCA and Irish Aid of the opportunities for development education at senior cycle. So I actually sat down and I looked at all the curriculum documents right across senior cycle. And I was really both impressed and delighted and somewhat shocked to find the scope that there is there, both within the curriculum itself explicitly, but also the principles underpinning and the values of most of the subjects are very much compatible with the kinds of principles and approaches of development education. So therefore that it's important to go back to the actual curriculum. But I think far more important than the curriculum opportunities that are explicitly there is the disposition we bring as teachers and the kind of lens we bring, isn't it, to our work. So the disposition of being opportunistic is one I mentioned in relation to planning, where it doesn't almost matter what subject you teach. I taught Irish, Peg Sayers, God help us. I still managed to bring a justice perspective into the Irish classroom. So I think it is that lens, and looking even over the weekend with my teacher's hat on, and I'm out of the classroom a while now, but I was looking at the Irish Times. The first thing I did, opened it up, and this world food thing pops out. I thought, God, I'd love to be in school on Monday. I'd bring that in. There's opportunities there for maths because there's loads of statistics in it about food and health, home ec, geography. There's a great class just in that handout from the Irish Times, being opportunistic. Then I went into the paper and I see our Nobel Peace Prize winners. Fantastic articles in The Guardian the last couple of days, beautiful pieces that could be used in a whole range of classes, including even English, I shouldn't say even, I'm thinking particularly English class, where you can have students debating what are the things I'd be prepared to take a stand for, like that little girl did, the 16-year-old Pakistani. And indeed, today's budget. If that's not an opportunity for development education, because a budget is a statement of what we value in society. Essentially, that's what it is. So who are the people who have power, who don't have power? Who are the people who are benefiting, who are not benefiting today? That's the kind of conversation that is supportive of the kinds of approaches to development education. Because if we don't make those local links, there's no point talking about it out there and over there as well. And indeed the water protests at the weekend as well. There's so much. So the opportunistic approach, I think, is really important. The radical approach, and radical in the sense of the etymology of the word, which means root. Getting down to the root and asking why. And the relevance one I have there is as a kind of a lens of relevance that's always important, because it's so, you know yourself, if you want to engage the students, they have to see it as mattering and being meaningful and connected to their world and their concerns. Some of the useful websites in this regard, just wanted to share with you, and this is where if you wanted to get a copy of this, it might be helpful. I mentioned The Guardian has great accessible articles, and particularly an education section of it that's very good on global development issues, if you wanted to have a look at that. And this particular website, globaldimensions.org.uk, is particularly good because they have lots of resources for teachers that are both subject and topic related. So you can go in, you can say, I'm teaching about land, geography, or whatever the topic might be. I want to show you another website that I came across recently as well that I think is particularly good. And it's Unicef workshops. And when you go into the unicef.ie and click on the workshops, these come up. The reason this is very good is because it's very teacher friendly. It's laid out with the topics and it's cross-curricular. Now, you saw on the Global Passport that one of the aims is to move beyond the individual classroom and to try and encourage more cross-curricular work across themes. So here, for example, if this isn't open, don't worry, but it has things like, in the maths class, how you can begin to calculate the cost of war. So, for example, the money that's spent on arms, if you could compare that with money that could be spent in other areas, what's the proportion, percentages, graphs, charts, all of that kind of stuff. And then and there's lots of other subjects as well where you can see where you can make cross-curricular themes relevant. And it's beautifully laid out, very relevant and up-to-date. So it's not opening up for us there, Aisling. We'll put the PowerPoint back, but I just wanted to share that with you because I thought it was particularly useful in that context. Other subject-specific ideas. Many of you are aware There's a number of networks being supported through the Worldwide Fund, and one of them is the Loreto Education Network. And what they've recently done is they set up on their education, on the Loreto website, they have a little section called Development Education. They're very generous because they've already put up some resources there that not just for their own schools and teachers, but for any teacher to look at. And as a starter, they've put up these subject-based little guides. So if you're an English teacher, maths, history, and you want ideas on how to incorporate development education. Now they're very tentative, and the idea is that over time they'll be added to by teachers in particular who will come up with additional and no doubt even better ideas. But it's just useful to know that that's there, and it's going to be growing as a site as well. And indeed, within your own schools, if you have similar materials to share, it'd be a good idea to make them available in that way. So extending then beyond your own class. So the first thing I always feel when people talk about a whole school approach, at the start, that can't really happen unless there's already good stuff happening within individual classes. So that's the starting point. But moving beyond that then, some of the ideas I think that have come from working with other schools and teachers recently, I have here in this slide. Just as when you're doing your subject planning and you have your column for literacy and numeracy, and that's become a very easy now, or easier part of planning than it might have been a few years back. I'd love to see a development education, social justice, whatever you want to call it, column where you're saying, how are we going to integrate a social justice perspective into our planning for this term? It doesn't mean every lesson, every class, but it would mean that you're going to at least identify one or two opportunities as a team to incorporate a justice perspective or a justice question. I think of on the table last night, one of my daughters was studying Of Mice and Men, John Steinbeck's novel. What a wonderful opportunity there for looking at relationships of power and human dignity and human rights and all of that. But I think in many cases those opportunities are missed. So if that column was there when the English teachers are sitting down to do their planning, the likelihood of that coming to the surface and becoming more explicit might be more likely. And then out of that, I know a number of schools where they've set up a shared folder or a shared file electronically, or it can be literally a physical shelf on the staff room, but more likely nowadays it's going to be a Moodle or a Google site or something like that, where you put up and say, this is something I came across and I used today. On the Oxfam site, there's a lovely exercise that you can use in maths class or whatever it is. The 5-minute slot at staff meetings, I think that's really important because there was a survey of schools done recently, one of the networks that's supported by the Worldwide, where principals were asked and teachers, how frequently is development education, social justice, whatever you want to call it, discussed at staff meetings? And in most cases the schools said never or rarely. Would that be reflective? Yeah. So, meanwhile, all of this good work is happening and it's not being reflected and discussed and shared at staff meetings. So even if you were to just nudge along and say, can we have a 5-minute slot at which we want to share ideas, we want to update on what's happening, we want to bring forward the agenda as a staff community, that would be a very practical way of moving things out. Serving the students about where and how they are encountering development education. The where is where it's happening, because sometimes it can be a bit of a scattergun all over the place, and sometimes different things happening that might even be in conflict with each other or sending out different messages. And some of the SSE questions are useful there. You know, where in your school self-evaluation you'd be well familiar with asking the questions around, well, what are we doing well? What could we do better? How can we plan the next steps and so on? Audit might be too strong a word, but certainly mapping out what's happening is useful because frequently students might have to get to transition year before they encounter development education, or else it's down to the particular teacher they have or haven't got along the way that might or might not bring this perspective. So by looking, saying, well, where in the junior cycle do we know students are really engaging in development education, and how can we build on that? And both within and outside the classroom, not just in the curriculum, but to kind of map out what's happening might be helpful as well. Then there's the hidden curriculum. I just want to finish, I suppose, by mentioning some thoughts to consider here. Particularly because I'm aware that a lot of what comes under the umbrella of development education is actually fundraising. And I'm not saying that fundraising is a bad thing, far from it, depending on how it's done. And it can be one genuine and real and meaningful expression of solidarity. However, even when students are fundraising, say the students were fundraising in your school for a homeless charity, and this is the image they're using, it does beg the question, is it reinforcing a stereotype? Is it helping them to look at the social economic factors that actually contribute to homelessness? And when you compare that image to maybe this one, which is another visual about the same issue, and this one's asking what triggers homelessness. And on this, the person with the can and the stereotype of the alcoholic homeless person, we see actually only 10% of people who are homeless, 9% in fact, are homeless as a result of drug or alcohol addiction. So it actually turns it a bit on its head, doesn't it? And we see that 35% are homeless due to loss of job. And this poster was produced in 2011, so in every likelihood this percentage is probably a bit bigger now, isn't it? So it's about questioning, even sometimes when students do projects and their work is displayed on the walls, is there a danger that that might be actually miseducating, misinforming and reinforcing stereotypes? Now you say, well, who am I to burst their bubble? They're after spending weeks and weeks producing this lovely piece of work. But that's where the critical perspective comes in at the outset. You don't wait, I suppose, until they're up on the walls to say, hold on a minute now, girls. But just to say, well, think about it. You know, what kind of message do you want to put up there? Let's think, is that the full picture? Is that going to really help to inform the other girls and boys in the school around this issue? See where I'm coming from? The textbooks, oh, this is one of my pet hates. And I'm sure you're well aware of that. And this is just obviously an extreme example of it, where you see some of the history books, again, coming back to a recent interaction. You pity my children at the table and doing their homework in the evening, having me looking over the shoulder. But Quiva came home and she's saying, I have to answer a question about why they went exploring. I said, oh, happy days. And she's saying, well, I said, why did they go exploring? I'm trying to be the good teacher, not telling her. And she said, because something got to do with trade and spices. They wanted to get spices, she said. Oh, they did they? Why did they want the spices? I don't know. Well, the motivation in terms of in terms of profit, in terms of greed, dare I say, none of that was coming through in the book whatsoever. It was all about adventure and new trade routes and exploring new territories. So we had a bit of a discussion around that, but she still decided that her answer was the right one, needless as children do. But it's not her fault, because the perspective of the book was a quite Eurocentric perspective, and would have been very different if the narrative and the story had been written from the other, from the side of those who were encountered on the shores. So there's a lot of that in the books that need, and that you can bring that awareness to with the students. The maps we use, this is the Mercator that you're well familiar with, and it was produced in 1595, I think, by Gerardus Mercator, a Flemish cartographer, and it's the one that's still up there. And unfortunately, IKEA have a big framed version of this now, and it's in children's bedrooms and it's in houses you go into now and everything, because it's because of I'd say it's freely available.
Google Maps use that as well.
Yeah, Google Maps are still using it as well. So it does make a difference, because again, it's down to our worldview, and when the actual landmass on that shows the actual size of the Earth is projected in the Peters projection, we see Africa is far bigger than we previously envisaged. Different maps there you can have a look at. You might be familiar with these, but again, might be worth just challenging perceptions in terms of planning for Dev Ed. How do you plan for the images that are around your school or in your classroom? What you do to try and broaden and critique the different perceptions that students have, including the notice boards. And I just have one little inspirational quote there, but sometimes I've been in classrooms where teachers have inspirational quotes up about, and it can be a very effective way as well of promoting positive images. So again, the notice boards in school, I think, reveal a lot. So overall, what it all boils down to is a very simple message, and my message would be one of, when planning for development education, to achieve impact, do less. It's not maybe in keeping with WorldWise, I don't mean in keeping with the WorldWise message, but in terms of, the impetus sometimes is, if you're trying to demonstrate impact, that you want to do more and more and more, and show the numbers of students that are involved and the number of things that are happening in your school. When in actual fact, sometimes doing less and going deeper, and even with a smaller number of students, might create deeper learning and ultimately greater change. And going back to the kinds of attitudes that we talked about at the start, it's more likely to challenge those attitudes as well if what you're doing is more thoughtful, more critical, more questioning, and deeper. Because insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting different results. So, I'm going to leave you with that thought, and I am conscious that we've 3 minutes to coffee time. And what I'd like you to do now, just for the last couple of moments, is in relation to what I've just presented, and you might say, well, it's all fine for her up there, but she's not in my school and hasn't a clue, and that's fine and true. Just turn to your partner beside you and give your response in relation to is there anything that you've heard in the last 20, 25 minutes that you strongly agree with and would want to affirm, or something you'd want to add or disagree with, okay?